We may not be aware that it's a boundary until it gets crossed.
Mm-hmm. When people see you violate your own boundary, people make an assumption, consciously or subconsciously, that your boundary has shifted and it is now okay for these things to happen.
We are picking up here right where we left off in our last episode. So let's talk about another one of the professional repercussions, and that would be everything to do with your career and setbacks in your progress toward your goals of whatever it is, in how you want to be and how you want to be seen. And when boundaries are violated, opportunities are withheld.
Mm-hmm.
And your reputation can take a hit.
It definitely impacts your leadership brand or your whatever your brand is for your career when you violate even your own boundaries sometimes, but for sure when you violate other people's boundaries or you ask people to violate their boundaries, it can definitely have a negative impact on your brand.
When you ask people to violate their boundaries?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes.
I know that it's important for you to have a lunch hour, but today you're not going to have one, okay?
Got it.
Okay, pumpkin?
Okay. Got it.
We need you to work through lunch today.
Yes. Okay.
You know that break that you're legally allowed to have? You're not going to have it today.
Okay. I'm picking up what you're laying down. Thanks.
Speaking of legal, that potentially in your career could be another area of boundary mismanagement or legal issues.
Yes. You think about a breach of trust, a breach of confidence, harassment, so many different things that could lead to legal issues. And this is another reason why it's really important, especially in a business setting, to be very clear on the boundaries.
Absolutely.
And finally, I think for both, it's relationships that get strained.
Absolutely. Relationships are important, both personally and professionally. And when boundaries are mismanaged, it for sure impacts relationships.
Yeah.
And not in a good way.
No. And here you're going to be talking about, do you have different sets of boundaries for professional and personal? And if so, be sure to keep them separate.
Right.
And if some of the professional boundaries serve you in your personal life, cool. And the reverse is true. But be very clear on the boundaries that you are engaging in the setting that you're in.
Yeah. And I just want to remind our listeners that boundaries are good. Boundaries are healthy. Boundaries keep everyone safe and in the game, so to speak. But it keeps everyone in play, and it's kind of like an operating book. It's your rules of engagement, if you will. And it's okay to have boundaries. It's a good thing to have boundaries.
I loved the sport analogy that you brought up in one of the last episodes, that it's about keeping yourself safe, helping others to be safe,
Absolutely.
Knowing the rules. So let's talk about how we take on the fact that a boundary has been mismanaged. Either I did something that violated one of your boundaries, or one of my boundaries has been violated.
Yeah. I think the first thing that we want to do is acknowledge that the boundary was violated or crossed, or however you want to phrase that. And I think it's important to understand the impact of that boundary and the impact of how, if I crossed your boundary, how it made you feel. And I need to be willing to understand that, because I may not think it's a big deal. I might not even recognize that that's really something important to you. So it's important that I lean into that conversation and understand from your perspective and your point of view why that's important and what did my crossing it do for us and our relationship. I think it's really important to acknowledge that.
A lot of communication that's got to go on.
What?
I know.
That darn communication just keeps popping up.
But you think about what we've talked about: leaning in, we've talked about listening, we've talked about mutual respect, we're talking about boundaries. It's about being able to be very clear and to care enough, not just to share, but to listen, to understand, You're not listening to disagree. You're listening to understand. And remember, you could be the one that did the violating, or you could be the one whose boundary was violated. And this is required for both parties. Usually the one whose boundary has been violated is the one that's in this really tough position to say, I have to own this. Nobody else can own this before I own this.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to sit there and ignore it, because we've talked about just a few of the many repercussions from letting things slide.
You let it slide once, it's going to keep happening.
There's that
over
chink.
and over and over. I think as you're communicating and acknowledging the boundary violation, you're having a conversation around that. It's really important that that boundary that was crossed is clearly defined, and that you then talk about what's acceptable going forward. I may not agree with your boundary. I might think your boundary is ridiculous. But if I respect you as a human being, I should be able to work within your boundary. And so we need to have a conversation. What's acceptable behavior going forward?
Okay.
Sometimes people have boundaries that might rub up against your own value system.
Mm-hmm.
That's a conversation to have.
Yes. It's not one to ignore.
Yeah.
It's also it's an intense conversation. Intense in the sense that we have to be authentic. We have to be willing to listen. We have to be ready to be heard. And just, it's that authenticity.
And I think too, we talked about this some time ago, but it's really about, it's the authenticity. It's about your intent of the conversation. Am I going in to prove my point, or am I going in to have an understanding between the two of us? This boundary was violated and we need to talk about that. And I want both of us to come out of that conversation better, not worse. I don't want to win the conversation. I want to come to some sort of mutual understanding. And going in with that right intent makes the conversation easier to have.
I think that would be a great note card to keep in one's back pocket. Just say, the way you position that. So I'm feeling like crap because you just called me out on something that I didn't know I'd done wrong.
Yeah.
Or maybe I did know I did it wrong. Okay, so now I'm having to face that.
Right.
So, but being able to set the stage, being able to create that safe zone. It said, okay, it's not about win and lose. It's not about you being a poop head. It's, this was a problem, and I would like us to be able to address it.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Yeah.
Establishing acceptable behavior for moving forward. Being able to include that we're going to have these kind of candid, authentic conversations about it because it matters.
Right.
If it didn't matter, you wouldn't be spending any of this time. You just say, oh, well,
right.
Too bad, so sad.
Too bad. Move on.
So it takes a lot of listening.
It does. And listening to understand, possibly listening to be influenced, transformed, really open up those ears.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And we have a whole episode or a whole segment on listening. And then there's owning up. It's like, okay, you need to apologize. As the person who did the violating, it's your responsibility to apologize and own up to the fact. Maybe you didn't know it was a boundary that got crossed. You can still apologize. Maybe you did know. And you have some splaining to do.
And I think it's important, if we violate our own boundaries, which we do, that we acknowledge that for ourselves and apologize to ourselves. Not just apologizing to other people, but taking the ownership of violating your own boundary and apologizing to yourself. And then having that internal dialogue of, do I need to shift my boundary? Is this something I'm going to continue to violate for myself? And then make the changes that you need to make, or re-identify what are the appropriate behaviors moving forward.
sounds like a really winning plan to move forward. So that means you take action.
Yeah,
You're going to adjust your behavior,
absolutely.
whether it's for self or in this engagement, the two people who have this boundary that they're trying to repair and manage well going forward. So you take action, you set new boundaries, clarify the ones that exist, establish new ones that are going to help manage as you approach that boundary, what you do to make sure you don't tromp on it. I don't know if that's officially a word, but I think it should be.
It is now.
Okay, good. Okay.
And then through that taking action, we want to work on rebuilding trust. And we have to be prepared that depending on the egregiousness, is that a word? Egregiousness?
It should be.
That's a 25-cent word there. Depending on the seriousness of the violation, that rebuilding trust can take a lot of time.
Yeah.
It may take weeks, months, years, or it could be we're good. Just, we got it. We talked about it. We're going to move forward. So I want to reiterate the importance of how you enter that conversation. You talk about the first 30 seconds of a conversation as your entry point. That first 30 seconds really will dictate the results that you get from the conversation. So think about how you're going to have a conversation about rebuilding trust after a violation of boundaries. Important thought work to go into before you have that conversation.
You have to care enough to care about how you do it. If
Absolutely.
it matters, if this relationship matters, then this conversation matters. The boundaries matter. And they're deserving of the respect from both parties.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then I think if, a lot of people aren't skilled at these kinds of conversations. There's a lot of emotions that might be wrapped up in the violation of boundary, depending on with whom this happened with. There could be long history. It could be short history. But if you need some help, get it. Whether that's from a trusted friend, possibly a coworker, a family member, a therapist, a coach. Get some help so that you can plan out the conversation a little bit and really think about what you want out of that conversation and what kind of impact you want to have on the relationship. Is it a relationship worth saving? Sometimes it's not. Sometimes we got to let people go. But that's a whole different story.
Some people are here for a season.
Exactly. But I think it's really important at the end of the day that we are willing and able to acknowledge crossed boundaries. We are willing to engage in conversation about making it right, fixing it going forward. What are those new behaviors that we need? And we have to do this with some patience, with some empathy, some seeking of understanding, and really working together towards that mutual respect that we consistently talk about. It's really about mutual respect and understanding. Yes. Anything else? I went on a little diatribe there.
No. No, and we'll probably cut out this last little, because it's like I want to say, amen.
With that, I'm DocShellie, my co-host Carla Lewis. Thank you for tuning in to Unapologetic Rabble-Rousers. We'll see you next time.
Take care.
It's about your intent of the conversation. Am I going in to prove my point, or am I going in to have an understanding between the two of us?